Tonight, new details on the arrest that drove a wedge between Canada and China. For the first time, we're seeing the moment Huawei exec Meng Wanzhou was detained. What it means for the case and escalating tensions with China.
These groups are the most extreme, radical fringes of the extreme right.
A Canadian reservist accused of recruiting neo-Nazis. And it's not the only case of hate and extremism in the forces.
It's been a nightmare.
And a Canadian gold medal hopeful sidelined for doping. Why she says she's innocent. This is The National. The arrest of Chinese telecom executive Meng Wanzhou triggered a diplomatic crisis for the Trudeau government. Since then, China detained 2 Canadians, put a third on death row, and has blocked billions of dollars worth of trade exports in apparent retaliation. Well, tonight, for the first time, we are seeing the very moment that thrust Canada into the middle of a global conflict, a conflict that continues to deepen. Tanya Fletcher explains what we've learned.
This new video shows the minutes after Meng Wanzhou's arrival at Vancouver International Airport last December on her way to Mexico, the same day she was arrested for extradition to the U.S. Hours and hours of footage show Meng detained in a secondary screening area as officers go through her luggage. Her lawyers filed the video with BC Supreme Court as part of a proceeding set to take place next month.
The question that all of these videos pose really is, when is it appropriate for Canada Border Services to detain someone that they knew they were going to arrest anyway?
The moments captured here could prove critical to the extradition case. Meng has claimed that the RCMP and Canada Border Services Agency coordinated with the FBI to have her arrested as part of a, quote, covert criminal investigation. Newly released documents show Meng told officers she was surprised that she was being arrested. "You're saying I committed fraud in the United States?" Meng is quoted in the transcript as saying, "You're saying because of my company, you're arresting me." The documents show Meng asked several times to speak with family members and appeared worried that she was going to be sent to the United States immediately. Her lawyers claim she was held for hours before being officially arrested without being told why, and that during that time her devices were seized. If that's true, Meng claims it would amount to a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The question is, when you arrive at the port of entry, when you arrive at the airport, and they know that they're going to detain you, what's the charade here? 3 hours of interviews, of questioning, of investigation, when really they're going to arrest you and hold you for extradition. Why wasn't that done immediately?
The CBSA and RCMP have denied the allegations. 8 months in, lawyers on both sides will be in court in September, arguing around disclosure related to Meng's arrest and those hours in December after Meng stepped off a plane and into an international tug-of-war. Tanya Fletcher, CBC News, Vancouver.
Now, those videos and new documents are all coming out just ahead of Meng's extradition hearing to face fraud charges in the U.S. Now, the CBC's Jason Proctor has been following this case from the beginning and was at BC Supreme Court this afternoon. So, Jason, the documents shed new light on the plans for her arrest.
Yeah, Andrew, this is one of the most intriguing parts of this whole new documentation dump that we've seen today. It seems that, according to Meng's lawyers, there was initially a plan for the officers at the airport to go right onto the plane and arrest her sort of as soon as it arrived in Vancouver on December 1st, 2018. Something changed, they say, in the hours and, the night before her actual arrival that saw her instead detained for 3 hours, roughly, by CBSA, they allege in violation of her charter rights, instead of that plan. And they want the documentation, the notes, the texts, the emails that they say that went back and forth between CBSA and RCMP and American authorities that led to that change.
And Jason, I mean, the consequence of all of this is painfully obvious, right? I mean, it's rocked Canada-China relations. So what happens now?
Well, essentially, there's a lot of pressure on many fronts to try to come to some type of diplomatic solution with regards to this. But the problem for Canada's point of view is that it's a fairly intractable issue in that Canada says it's a rule of law country, and what's actually happening here is a fairly routine extradition request on the, on the part of a neighbor and an ally.
All right, Jason Proctor will continue following this. Thanks so much. The case is back in court mid-September when more documents may be disclosed, but the formal extradition hearings to the U.S. aren't expected to start until January of 2020.
Let's turn now to another major issue that has Ottawa's attention. Terrorism experts describe it as a white supremacist cult that's gunning for a race war. And tonight, it appears a member of Canada's military reserve may be one of its key operatives. Both the RCMP and the Canadian Forces are investigating an Army reservist accused of recruiting for the extreme right hate group that calls itself The Base. As Karen Pauls reports, the allegations come after the neo-Nazi group was infiltrated by a reporter with the Winnipeg Free Press.
It was a warm summer evening when reporter Ryan Thorpe came to this park, undercover, posing as a white nationalist.
I was a bit scared going into it.
This was the final step in the process of joining The Base, which put up posters around Winnipeg hoping to recruit members for a 2 to 3 man paramilitary cell.
They believe a race war is on the horizon, and they welcome it. They want it to get here.
Thorpe says the group's recruiter was 26-year-old Patrick Matthews. The military has confirmed Master Corporal Matthews is an active reserve member in the 38 Canadian Brigade Group. He has some explosives training, but they gave this assurance.
Master Corporal Matthews has no ability to obtain explosives through the military, and he has no access to weapons.
Last November, an internal report identified 53 Canadian Forces members belonging to hate groups or promoting extremist views. A review of racism in the military is now underway.
We don't want anybody in uniform with that type of behavior festering in the Canadian Armed Forces.
That's not good enough for this anti-hate activist.
These neo-Nazis and white supremacists are walking into our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, and they're murdering us. And now we hear that they are actually getting training in the Canadian military.
Monday night, in this video circulating on social media, the RCMP were seen surrounding Matthews' home. Police seized firearms but say no one is in custody.
But still no comment.
Matthews was home today, but he refused to speak to us.
These groups are the most extreme, radical fringes of the extreme right.
From his brief vantage point inside the group, Ryan Thorpe says homegrown hate is a very real threat across Canada.
They welcome, these mass shootings and they want high casualties.
Thorpe hopes his story exposes this dark underworld, and he hopes the authorities take action. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
How should the federal government deal with Canadians who joined ISIS? That question has been thrust back into the spotlight this week. The man known as Jihadi Jack wants Canada to take him in, and he isn't the only one. Salima Shivji has more on whether the government will answer that call.
From a Kurdish prison in northern Syria, plea after plea.
And I always expected Canada would help me, and they didn't. I hope Canada does take me from here if they can. I want to make a difference, I want to try and make up to the world that which I did against it.
To convince Canada to take him in. Jack Letts is now only Canadian after the UK stripped him of citizenship, but that doesn't mean he'll be back here anytime soon.
Our first obligation is to look after the national security of the country and the safety of Canadians. This individual and others have made the calculated decision to leave.
Mere weeks before an election call, the UK's move has the Liberals in a bind, contrasting this.
Terrorist attacks against this country. A Canadian is a Canadian.
From 2015, when Justin Trudeau said he'd restore rights of Canadians convicted of terrorism, to today's tougher line.
We are under no legal obligation to facilitate his travel, and we will not do that.
Strikingly similar to what the Conservatives are saying.
Of course, Canada has an obligation to all its citizens, but that does not mean that we have to proactively try to go and assist someone who is currently being held in prison for his horrendous crimes.
Crimes that have not been proven in court and could be hard to prove if he's brought back here to face trial. Let's may be the case with the highest profile, but there are more than a dozen other Canadians held in Syria who left Canada allegedly to join ISIS, plus 18 of their children. On their repatriation, too, a slight hardening of position from the Liberals.
We're looking very carefully at circumstances that may affect orphans. What we don't want to do is to create a set of circumstances that in fact causes a second generation of terrorist behavior.
Of course, this case isn't only a minefield for the Liberals domestically. Canada has made it very clear they're not impressed with the UK's move, and Justin Trudeau is sure to bring it up with Britain's new Prime Minister when they meet for the first time at the G7 this weekend. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Ottawa.
The campaign hasn't officially started, but leaders are already on the trail. Today, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer announced part of a plan that he says will make life more affordable for Canadians. Katie Simpson explains why he's making that promise now.
It's probably a little too...
It was a little cliche. Andrew Scheer cuddled babies in the hopes of winning their parents' votes.
As Prime Minister, I will make EI maternity leave benefits tax-free.
The Conservatives are promising a non-refundable 15% tax credit on EI earnings made during parental leave. The pitch is a preview of the party's larger election strategy.
When we talk to people directly, they're telling us a story of how they're working harder and harder, longer and longer, but they're falling further and further behind.
Conservative sources say their campaign will focus on one main question: do Canadians feel like they're getting ahead? Scheer will pitch himself as the only candidate able to ease economic anxieties. And while he won't ignore the Prime Minister's ethics violation on the SNC-Lavalin affair, the party will try not to stray from its main economic message. CBC's polls analyst says since the Ethics Commissioner's report was released in the peak of summer vacation, it's unclear how it will resonate.
We've seen from a number of polls that cost of living is one of the top concerns, one of the top issues going into this election. And usually it's that kind of thing that decides how people are going to vote.
The Liberals will counter the Conservative attacks by lumping Scheer in with Ontario Progressive Conservative Premier Doug Ford, who has made a series of unpopular funding cuts.
I think Canadians can clearly see what's happening in Ontario, and they should know that Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford are two peas in a pod.
The Liberals also say Scheer's promise today does nothing for low-income families who do not have a large tax burden to begin with.
For a parent earning $50,000, Scheer says the credit will be worth $4,000. Expect the Conservatives to make these kinds of financial promises aimed at families throughout the election campaign. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Ottawa.
And that first English debate is set for October 7th. It will be held in the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau with 5 moderators from Canadian news media, including our own Rosemary Barton.
Now to Montreal, where we heard directly from Laurence Vincent Lapointe, the elite Canadian canoeist who had hoped to make Olympic history next year in Japan, but who instead is facing a doping suspension. Everything she's worked for in question. Now, Tokyo 2020 will be the first Summer Games to feature women's canoeing. Canada's hopes had largely rested on Lapointe's shoulders, but what happens going forward is very uncertain. Alison Northcott now with what the suspension could mean.
And it's Laurence Vincent Lapointe from Canada off to a flying start.
With her sights set on the 2020 Olympics, Laurence Vincent Lapointe is a powerhouse in her sport. With multiple world championships, her future looked bright until now.
Every single day putting all my heart and all my strength into everything I do. And last week, it just all fell down. It just, my world fell apart.
Vincent Lapointe was suspended after she tested positive for a banned substance called Ligandrol. Now her Olympic dreams are in jeopardy.
They found something in my system, and I have no idea how it got there. I mean, we're working to find it, but I just cannot believe it. It's been a nightmare.
She and her lawyer say they suspect she may have taken a contaminated supplement.
There are many, many recent cases where supplement contamination has been known to be the cause of findings for this specific substance.
Vincent Lapointe says she got the supplements from a Canadian sports centre, which got them from a company she says tests its products for banned substances. Still, the burden of proof is on her to show that she didn't take the substance intentionally and to demonstrate if a contaminated supplement is to blame.
It is not frequent, but it is frequently invoked.
And the athletes, it's difficult for athletes to not only prove that it was contaminated, but that there is no negligence on their part by consuming the supplement.
Laurence Vincent Lapointe way out in front.
Sanctions could range from a warning to a 4-year ban.
She is the superstar of the canoe.
This analyst says missing the Olympics would be devastating for her and her teammates.
She is the best, and she doesn't need to cheat to be the best. And she's been proving it for years.
Lapointe will have a hearing in the coming months to make her case. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Now, if you're like most people, you've never heard of Ligandrol before today, and there's good reason for that. It's an unapproved experimental drug, though it is clearly on the radar of those whose job it is to keep sports clean. So what is it and what does it do? Much like an anabolic steroid, Ligandrol increases muscle mass without increasing fat. It can make you stronger, faster, and that's why it's banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency. As a drug, it's also not authorized in Canada, but given this country's unregulated supplements industry, it's possible it's in some products. There have been several other recent high-profile suspensions due to Ligandrol in football, basketball, martial arts, and swimming.
I'm not going to stop until I prove my innocence.
Australian freestyle swimmer Shayna Jack is one of those cases, tested positive back in June. Like Vincent Lapointe, she also blames contaminated supplement. Now, it's possible both have a viable defense. An American and a Japanese athlete recently had their suspension significantly reduced after proving that they had taken Ligandrol inadvertently.
We are live on The National. Following a developing story out of Alberta tonight, some homes in a small community east of Calgary have been evacuated following a fatal multi-vehicle crash involving a fuel tanker. Here's some video just coming into our newsroom showing the large plumes of smoke coming from the scene of the collision near the hamlet of Chinook. Emergency services confirming that one person is dead, another in life-threatening condition. At least 8 others have been injured. Police believe 12 vehicles were involved in the crash, with one being a semi-truck hauling fuel, the other carrying butane. And the RCMP says 2 people were involved in a float plane crash in New Germany, Nova Scotia. Officials say it happened just before 5 o'clock Atlantic time. A man and woman taken to hospital. Investigators believe the plane was attempting to land at a nearby lake when it clipped a set of power lines.
Bell Canada says new government regulation will cost it millions, and so 200,000 rural households will pay the price. Bell is cutting them out of a program to expand high-speed internet access in Canada, and the blame for that decision, they say, belongs to the CRTC for limiting what they can charge competitors who use their infrastructure. Bell calls the new limits a tax. Critics call it fair and square. And as Jacqueline Hansen shows us, it is rural Canadians caught right in the middle.
We're 900 meters away from fiber internet.
David Yeaman's plastic mold injection business is just rural enough that high-speed internet is out of reach. Now, that's holding him back.
It's changed tremendously because software in the cloud didn't exist 13 years ago when we first moved in here.
He's limited to a slow wireless connection over satellite. Uploading and sharing a single plastic mold design can take 4 or 5 hours.
To put that in perspective, if we were in the city of Barrie, that would take 20 minutes.
Yeaman's worried that if Bell cuts back on its plan to expand rural internet access, it will slow down his shot at a better connection. But Bell says it has its own problems. The CRTC, the country's telecom regulator, ordered internet providers like Bell to lower wholesale prices permanently, in some cases by more than 75%, and it applies retroactively. Bell says it'll cost them $100 million, so it's cutting its rural expansion by 20% to help come up with the money.
In effect, what we're seeing is a temper tantrum, that they are going to withhold connectivity to rural Canadians until I don't know what happens. Their profits return.
For independent internet providers like Tech Savvy, it's a big win.
We'll be able to make much more confident decisions going forward, not only for investments, but also for pricing for our customers.
But rural Canadians likely don't have access to those smaller independent providers, so that doesn't help them either. Yeaman says Bell and Rogers have told him he can get fiber installed if he pays for it, between $300,000 and $400,000.
We have to figure out whether we have to invest that much money in the infrastructure ourselves, which clearly we can't afford, and or we have to move out of the area.
The need is undeniable, yet a solution now seems even further down the road. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Oro-Medonte, Ontario.
Still ahead on the National, a first in Canada, how HIV testing kits may soon be available at home.
And later, first responders saved their son's life. Their reunion is tonight's moment.
At that time, really the police officers and doctors, they seemed like a family. Everybody caring, giving us information.
HIV rates are on the rise in Canada. According to the latest numbers, more than 2,400 people were diagnosed in 2017. That has been steadily climbing for 3 years. And what's more, 1 in 5 people didn't know they had the infection. Researchers are hoping to change that by launching a clinical trial for an HIV self-testing kit that could be ready for sale in Canada by next year. As Vicadopi explains, the benefits could go far beyond convenience.
Instructions. HIV tests used to take weeks. Now it's just a minute. These 3 little vials and a drop of blood is all it takes for a clear diagnosis. This community clinic performs 9,000 HIV tests on people a year. The director says demand is as strong as ever, and getting these kits on pharmacy shelves and in people's hands could meet the need.
A real option of a fast test, but also a private test and something they can get outside the health authorities.
Canada's HIV numbers aren't going down. There's a new diagnosis every 4 hours. It's an infection rate similar to the European Union's, but Canada is falling behind high-income countries like Germany, Sweden, and Australia. And some Canadians are more vulnerable than others. Black and Indigenous people are less than 9% of our population, yet make up almost half of new HIV cases. Experts estimate as many as a quarter of people with HIV have not been tested for it. Stigma is part of the problem. That's why Mike Smith didn't get tested when he was growing up north of Toronto. For Smith, getting professional advice about sexual health was not an option.
This doctor was just not open, was very judgmental, and I always felt nervous going to doctor's appointments, even if I had the flu. I mean, I would be too.
Smith works to encourage men to get checked for their HIV status. Even with better access to testing in the healthcare system, barriers remain.
People don't want to go to an overcrowded sexual health clinic to get tested. People still fear facing homophobia from their doctor. These things can be addressed with a home self-testing kit.
Inside your self-testing kit.
That's why the European Union approved the same take-home tests for sale 3 years ago. Health Canada wants clinical trial evidence from Canada before it does the same. The researcher heading that trial says Canada is playing catch-up, not just in approving the tests for sale, but in attitudes towards HIV self-testing.
I mean, this is going on around the world, right? And we know it's working. I think, Canadians are very cautious, in some ways perhaps a bit too paternalistic about this. We have to put confidence in people and give them choices.
Giving people that choice could mean the difference between getting treatment and infecting others. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Still ahead on the National, offsetting a royal carbon footprint, why A-list celebrities are now defending Harry and Meghan.
But first, tracking Siberian tigers. With their population on the decline, we look at efforts to save the species. These Siberian tiger cubs could secure a future for a species on the brink of extinction. This is the breeding center in northeastern China, and it plans to bring 100 cubs into the world by the end of the year. But working against that future are poachers, hunting the hunters for their fur and body parts. It's very much a race against time and greed in the forests of Asia's Far East. And so Chris Brown traveled to the Russian side of that region for a rare up-close look earlier this year at the effort to protect a vanishing predator.
He is one of nature's greatest
and most beautiful predators. The Siberian tiger is the largest of the tiger species, whose thick fur allows it to survive in the world's coldest climates. He doesn't even notice our camera as he senses vulnerable prey is near. His killer instincts take over as he stalks and then pounces. In the blink of an eye, the violent attack is over. We're actually watching this go down from a safe spot at a safari park. And this is arguably Russia's most famous tiger. His name is Amur.
Тигр Амур в полном расцвете сил. Ему в апреле исполнится 7 лет. То есть тигр красавец.
Dmitry Mezhentev is the director here.
Он символ Приморья, Дальнего Востока и, наверное, уже России.
And Timur, the goat.
You might remember Amur from this video. A few years back, he became a global celebrity by befriending a goat named Timur that was supposed to be his dinner. Amur may have been born in captivity, but his prominence transcends his confined space. He's emerged as a symbol of hope for an entire species at risk.
It's incredible how well Siberian tigers blend in with their surroundings. They're notoriously difficult to spot in the wild, which is why you have to come to some place like this to see them. This whole area around Vladivostok and the far east of Russia is Siberian tiger territory. They were once some of the most endangered animals on Earth.
From just a few dozen animals in the mid-20th century, there were 490 Siberian tigers as of 2018. That's still not a lot, so when people see a tiger, it's a big deal. Leaping across a highway, or here, trying to blend in like a tree. When Russian conservationists called us to say we had a chance to film a tiger in the wild and to meet Amur, we hopped on a plane and headed to the city of Vladivostok. It's obvious once you get here just how revered tigers are. There are statues and monuments everywhere. Our destination was a one-of-a-kind tiger rehabilitation center, and the tiger we came to see was Tikhon, a 13-year-old male. Over Christmas, he got into trouble with some villagers by eating their pets. After he was tranquilized, scientists realized Tikhon had a problem with his teeth. So they cleaned and repaired his damaged fangs. Tiger biologist Sergei Aramilev said Tikhon seemed to be ready to be released back into the wild.
Мы сделали зубы, кормили его хорошим мясом, и когда это все прошло, просто неожиданно, очень неожиданно, и
just as we arrived, Tikhon died. So instead of witnessing his freedom, the Russian authorities gave us unprecedented access to observe their scientific teams as they performed his autopsy. Every time a tiger dies, there has to be an investigation to determine the cause of death, to know if something illegal, such as poaching, was responsible. They look for gunshot wounds, stab marks, or signs of poisoning, and later they'll look at his organs to understand if perhaps his diet or food sources were the problem. It all helps authorities understand the stresses the tiger population faces. They cleaned his fur and measured him from tail to toe before hoisting him up to see his weight when he died.
So they just weighed Tikhon, and they know he was about 140 or so kilograms at his death, and that's pretty light. They think he should have been upward around 200 or so kilograms for a 13-year-old male tiger. They're not sure why he was so, he wasn't heavy. Obviously it had dental work, he had trouble eating before, so that could be one possibility, but there's obviously a lot more going on here, and that's what this, this necropsy is hopefully going to give some answers to.
он сгнил уже весь, бедный рот у него.
It's sad to see such a great beast at the end of its life, especially knowing how fragile the population remains. But Aramilev says Tihan did his part.
Единственный, наверное, момент, то, что тигр прожил достаточно длительную жизнь, да, и он успел достаточно много сделать.
The final cause of death, we were told later, dehydration and exhaustion. Tihan basically died of natural causes. At the rehab center, hopefully, a more positive story is about to unfold. These two cubs, Elena and Pavlik, were rescued after their mother had to be relocated because she ate 6 dogs in a Russian village. But rather than sending the cubs to zoos and a life of captivity, Viktor Kuzmenko, who runs the rehab center, is training them to hunt and to fend for themselves so they can be reintroduced into the wild.
Чтобы у них не было ассоциации человек-кот. Это очень сложный процесс, и в 2 словах ответить на ваш вопрос, вот специально не ходили, я не могу. То есть это есть определенные правила, да, которые мы придерживаемся при работе с тиграми. И основная наша задача, чтобы тигр избегал человека, чтобы он к человеку не привыкал. Надеемся, что они экзамены все сдадут.
The no humans rule is strictly enforced. We could only watch them on these monitors. And even when Vladimir Putin visited in 2014, Russia's president had to keep his distance too. The Kremlin helps fund this center, as well as many of the other tiger conservation measures. The young tigers are taught to hunt using wild animals. Usually a deer is released into the pen, and the tigers chase it down and finish it off with a bite to the neck. In the past 5 years, this center has rehabilitated and released 7 tigers. Other measures such as monitoring have helped too. Cameras such as this one capture extraordinary sights, such as 4 tiger cubs playing all day. There are more than 800 such cameras all over Russia's Far East. But for all the successes, the greatest threat faced by tigers remains people who want to kill them for their furs and body parts.
Эта вот шкура была изъята у китайского гражданина, который пытался ее переправить через границу.
Sergei Aramilev, the biologist, has a freezer full of seized illegal trophies he shows us.
Headshot. Yes.
A headshot, right?
Yes. Вот это было первое попадание, попали в шею.
The market for such items, he says, is almost all in China, where tiger parts fetch a high price.
Для них важен сам статус, да, потому что если в семье в Китае есть шкура, да, то это престижно. Ну и плюс какие-то там есть религиозные вещи, ну их тоже можно понять, у них 3000 лет, да, у них это культура, и в один день ее изменить невозможно.
A crackdown, though, by Russia's government on poaching does seem to be working. In 2010, up to 70 tigers a year were killed by poachers. Now the number is closer to 15 to 20.
Да.
That's thanks in part to conservation officers such as Andrei Zakharov and his team.
Охота закончилась у нас сейчас на данный момент. Сейчас охоты нет ни на что.
He leads one of 14 dedicated anti-poaching teams. They ride in armored personnel carriers, often camping for days at a time. We spent one day with them.
А это что-то такое вот не от мира сего. Вещь. Она может находиться в 50 метрах от нас, вот таком вот немножечко вверх, и мы ее не видим, пока она не шевельнется. Только потом понимаешь, вот до такой степени это скрытный живот.
The other part of his job is dealing with those angry villagers who lose their pets to tigers. And there are lots of those stories on Russian TV.
Тигр схватил собаку мою маленькую с конурой прямо.
While her dog was killed, this woman was luckier.
Тигр его подцепил, ее лапой попытался вытащить.
There was lots of blood from the lucky escape. So, to stop people from shooting problem tigers, which is illegal, Zakharov and his crew try to calm things down and hand out compensation.
Человек, мы пришли в его дом. Да, есть такие случаи, что он нападает на скотину, нападает на коров, нападает на лошадей, нападает на собак, забирает собак. Но Но если у человека все нормально с документами, все нормально, но государство компенсирует эти затраты.
Siberian tigers are still listed as an endangered species. But Sergei Aramilev says after decades of worry, the trajectory is finally looking up.
Но заходя в лес на Дальнем Востоке, ты ощущаешь такое ощущение сказки, да, чего-то неизведанного, потому что там живет хозяин этой тайги, тигр. Он всегда присутствует, незримо следы, энергетика. И с учетом того, что этот зверь вызывает уважение и гордость, я считаю, что он должен жить рядом с нами.
The official conservation target is to have a population of 700 wild adult Siberian tigers and cubs in 4 years' time, and authorities believe they'll get there. Chris Brown, CBC News, near Vladivostok, Russia.
Now, 2 of the tigers you saw there in Chris's piece, the cubs, Elena and Pavlik, were released into the wild in May. They are reportedly hunting big game and thriving.
Still ahead on The National, how the journey to get a lung transplant almost cost one Nova Scotia woman her life.
On January 3rd, I did mention palliative care to the doctors, and I was ready to just call it quits and give up.
The roadblocks to life-saving procedures many in Canada still face.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast, Front Burner, in the wake of a mob-related shooting in Toronto over the weekend, a conversation about organized crime in Canada. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Celebrations tonight aboard the charity ship Open Arms as it finally docked in Italy. Nearly 100 migrants were able to return to land after nearly 3 weeks stranded at sea. Today, Italy's prosecutor ordered the ship seized and the migrants evacuated. The move ended a weeks-long standoff between the Spanish charity and the government in Rome. And a political crisis is unfolding in Italy tonight. The country's Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, resigned after his coalition partner called for a no-confidence vote. Now, what happens next is up to the Italian president. He can either try to cobble together a new coalition or call for new elections fewer than 18 months after the last vote. A Nova Scotia woman is celebrating a second chance at life following a successful double lung transplant last spring. But the high cost almost made her give up on that chance. There are only 4 cities in Canada with hospitals that perform lung transplants. Patients from the Atlantic provinces typically have to travel to Toronto for the surgery, and they may have to live there for months while they wait for a donor lung to become available. The cost of moving and other costs like rent are only partially covered by the healthcare system. The rest falls to patients and their families, like 43-year-old Natalie Jarvis from Nova Scotia. The financial burden was enough that she considered palliative care over life-saving surgery. Jarvis brought her story to CBC News and managed to raise money to fund her care and inspire change. Carolyn Ray has her story.
Is that good? This is a special moment for Natalie Jarvis and her grandson Colby. Their first time on the swing set this year, but even better, this is the first time Colby has seen his grandmother without an oxygen tank.
I'm still here, I'm breathing, I have no tubes, I'm not dragging my friends with me, my oxygen. So it was a rough go, but I think in the end it was worth it.
Last Christmas, Jarvis was told she needed an urgent double lung transplant in Toronto, but there was a problem. Jarvis couldn't afford rent in Toronto, let alone food and transportation. She needed at least $10,000 before she got on the plane. Nova Scotia would only chip in $1,500 a month. Jarvis, a call center worker, thought her life was over.
On January 3rd, I did mention palliative care to the doctors, and I was ready to just call it quits and give up.
But in the end, her doctor convinced her to fight. Jarvis told her story to CBC News, and people from across the country sent money. She could finally focus on her health instead of finances.
it's amazing how much support I actually got. Not only from family and friends, but just from strangers.
Her story also pushed Nova Scotia to give transplant patients an extra $1,000 a month. Jarvis received her new lungs in April. The recovery hasn't been easy. She'll never forget her first breath when she finally went outside.
Nothing could ever replace that. They say it's like being born again, and that's exactly what it is. It's like being born again and having that first breath.
Jarvis still has to take it slow, but she's cherishing these moments. Now that she's home, Jarvis plans to speak out on behalf of other patients too sick to fight for themselves. Carolyn Ray, CBC News, Upper Kennetcook, Nova Scotia.
And up next on The National, a special thank you from one family to a team of first responders.
You guys are his real heroes in life. When he grows up, he will definitely look upon you guys and try to be one of you guys.
Their reunion is tonight's moment. But first, Harry and Meghan have done much to boost the royal family's image. They're young, popular, progressive, including on environmental issues. But on that front, they're facing something of a backlash for what some see as saying one thing and doing another.
Looking after our environment is a lifelong commitment. We are all part of a global family, and we share the understanding and universal privilege of being able to inhabit this earth.
A noble sentiment, but is it just sentiment? The Duke and Duchess are taking heat for their use of private jets, including a recent visit to Elton John in southern France. Critics say that flies in the face of their public stance on climate change, a cause they've been vocal about, including on social media, recently employing their 9 million Instagram followers to consider that there is a ticking clock to protect our planet. Let's save it. Let's do our part. Just one of several posts on the need to protect the environment, and a mission echoed by the royal family generally, especially Prince Charles, who's warned of potentially catastrophic global warming. But despite attempts to reduce their carbon footprint, a recent report found the royal CO2 emissions from international travel have actually gone up dramatically, from 1,700 tons last year to more than 3,300 this year. Meanwhile, Sir Elton himself is deeply distressed at the backlash, reminding critics that as royals, Harry and Meghan have security concerns that justify private jets. A number of other celebrities have also jumped in, suggesting it's the royal message that matters.
It's time to take personal responsibility and realize what a privilege it is for us to live alongside nature.
And with an E. New season this fall on CBC.
5 minutes. That's how long 3-year-old Armin Donish was underwater before first responders arrived and saved his life, a situation where every moment mattered. Well, the boy from Mississauga, Ontario, and his family recently got the chance to meet those first responders, and the boy's father, entirely unsurprisingly, was so grateful for Armin's second chance at life. That is our moment.
There was a sense of relief knowing that these people are there. They were the first responders. They knew exactly what they're dealing with. My sister called and she said, I want you to come home. And I said, what happened? And she said, Armand has drowned. Is he going to survive? Is he not going to survive? That was the main question. The word thank you was such a small thing at that moment to tell them. Really, the police officers and doctors, they seem like a family. That's why I said to the Peel Police that you guys are his real heroes in life. When he grows up, he will definitely look upon you guys. To win someone's heart, it's really hard. You have to do something really special. And that's what they have done.
And so Ramin, the boy's father, clearly he's grateful for a very obvious reason, but also a less obvious one. So he came to Canada from Afghanistan 16 years ago, and he said that growing up, his experience was very different, that if there was an emergency and you called paramedics or police, Often they came late, sometimes not at all. So this was a very altogether different experience for him in a few ways.
It is an extraordinary thing, Andrew, especially in the big cities, and I'm sure there are exceptions and there are communities that don't have this, but I've called 911 a couple of times walking around in downtown Vancouver for somebody with a medical emergency. You can hear the fire trucks respond within seconds of making that call. As I say, it is an amazing system.
Well, I'm sure it's something that a lot of people take for granted, too. That's The National for this August 20th. Have a good night.
Good night.